FM 100.9 WLAF. We are pleased to have on the line with us a WLAF alum. His name is Smith Ray, but his nickname is Smitty. And Smitty, take us through that very first day on WLAF. You were here on North 5th Street in May of 1953.
That's correct. I had been in college and had withdrawn from college because I'd been accepted for flight training with the aviation cadets in the Air Force. But before I could get there, I had a attack of kidney problems from an old football injury and had to have a very serious operation. So I was at home, and my dad said that he thought that they were looking for someone to work at the new radio station. So I applied and was accepted. So I was the kid on the block that first day. I was scared to death. I remember that Pennies from Heaven played all day long on the radio, and an airplane flew over the town, dropping little cardboard cards with pennies attached to them, and the call letters and announcing that the town had a new radio station. So that goes back a long way, of course, and I, being the young kid on the block, I got all the choice assignments, like signing off at 12 o'clock at night, and on Sunday morning opening up at 5 in the morning. But other than that, I worked at WLAF 2 times. The first time was I described. Then I had recovered enough that Uncle Sam came calling, and I went to the Army. And when I came out of the Army, I went back to WLAF. That was probably in 54, I guess, or maybe 55. And at that time, the management, Marvin Paul, who had been the chief engineer, was the manager, and a great, great guy. He was just popular as he could be, and even-tempered, and really a fine human being. So I worked there until March of 57, and from there I went to WNOX in Knoxville in the sales department. I auditioned on the air at 4 radio stations, WLW, WLAC, WNOX. WLAC in Nashville offered me a job as the L&N Star reporter to do 6 5-minute newscasts a day, all under the same voice for the L&N Railroad. But the only problem was they did not want to pay me as much as I was making at WLAF. So I passed on that and took the job in Knoxville. Those early days, that second stint I had, of course, Al Rotella was the great, great football coach. His son, Jamie, was Bambino. I held Jamie on my lap while I played records. He, of course, later became a consensus All-American linebacker at the University of Tennessee. And Al did the basketball games, and I did the color. And then I did the football games for, I guess, 2 years before I left. So that's kind of is a replay of that.
And we are visiting with WLAF alum Smith Ray, affectionately called Smitty.
I remember, I'm having trouble remembering, I guess it was the 56 or maybe 56. It had to have been the 56 state high school basketball tournament was held in Memphis. And so Marvin Paul had guarded up enough sponsors for Al and I to make the trip. And so we were talked into broadcasting all 16 games, which we did. The tournament was held at Memphis State, but there was no broadcast facility, so we had to sit on a top row, and I had to juggle all the commercials and whatnot in a notebook, and helped Al with spotting. So we broadcast all 16 games, and when we got back home, we found that through some happenstance at the switching center, either in Nashville or in Knoxville, that the games had been bootlegged without being paid for. And they were carried on probably 20 radio stations in East Tennessee that we didn't know about at the time, and our folks at WLAF didn't know about it. But at any rate, that was some week. And Al Rotella was just a tremendous human being, and I miss him to this day.
When, Smitty, you went to La Follette High School, what year did you graduate?
I graduated in 1950, and Hugh Garner, who we just lost, as you know, was 51. I was in the same class with Jim Agee, and we had several notable graduates, not myself included, but probably one of the most accomplished people who ever came out of Campbell County was a young man named Bob Summit. And Bob kind of was instrumental in the reason I went to Davidson College with him over in North Carolina. Bob transferred to Tennessee, became a doctor, graduated as a doctor, and spent his career as a teacher at the University of Med School in Memphis, and he was then became the dean of the med school of the University of Tennessee Med School. And, of course, he's passed several years ago. Then other people in that class, Jerry Troutman was a great friend. Mac Mauney, his dad was the president of the First National Bank, and Mac has passed also. He became a computer executive. So a number of people like that. Hugh Garner was a great individual. He was just a solid human being. There wasn't a mean bone in his body. But I'll tell you the truth, you never got hit hard till you got hit by Hugh Garner.
We're pleased to have Smith Ray, with us on the radio this afternoon, WLAF in La Follette, and some local memories sharing with us.
Another great player, a great football player that we had in that, not in that class, but he was a class behind us, was Ray Chapman, Arliss Chapman's older brother. Ray started at center for Tennessee for 2, maybe 3 years. He was a tremendous football player.
Now, Smitty, give us an idea of what it was like in La Follette when you grew up, and maybe what neighborhood where you grew up, and an idea of who was on the radio, some of the other personalities at WLAF in those days when you were here back in the 1950s.
Yeah, well, as far as growing up, of course, it's a different culture now. Kids could go all over town, and we did on our bicycles. And where I lived was right next door to the bailiff house that caught on fire this week up on Central Avenue, although that was before, of course, the bluff was cut off to make it 4-lane, and we had a large front yard overlooking Central, and it was real pretty. Of course, they cut it off and kind of, they didn't really help the appearance of those houses up there, but so I lived right next door to the bailiffs, and Mac Mauney lived a block behind us over there. Well, I remember as kids in grammar school, we had a pickup little football team, nothing formal, of course, and we'd play the guys from West La Follette, and that would be Jerry Troutman and Hugh Garner, and they would come over to East La Follette School, and we'd go up in a field full of rocks and play football. And, of course, Hugh Garner would run over all of us, but that was another story that I'm not too proud of. As far as on the radio, when WLAF opened, we had a staff announcer, Carl Smith, and he was the beginning of a music program at the high school. He was the music teacher. They were trying to start a band at La Follette High, and he had been hired to do that, so he was an announcer.
And we're visiting with a WLAF alum, Smitty Ray, here on the old radio station. Smitty, a graduate of La Follette High School, 1950, the class, and then, of course, worked a couple of stints here at WLAF.
We had Olin Morris was a big-time radio voice, if there ever was one, and the style of the great announcers who used to come out of the Midwest, Nebraska, and whatnot. Olin was from Oak Ridge. He was a local young man, and he did the football games originally. He did not stay there all the time because he was on the sister station, which was WATO in Oak Ridge. Olin incidentally continued his broadcast career, and I lost track of him through the years, but he became the president of general manager of WREC television in Memphis. So he had quite a successful career. As far as personalities, when I came back from my second stint after my 13 months in the Army, Denny Walker, I don't know if you're familiar with that name.
Yes.
But Denny Walker had landed there. He was absolutely, hands down, the best country radio announcer I ever heard. He was absolutely something else. Now, Denny had, sometimes he would get in that brown bottle a little bit more than he should have. And so you had to, by that time, I was the titular program manager, and it became about a twice-a-month thing that somebody would call and say Denny didn't show up, and so I'd have to go. But Denny, then I understand later on, he moved on to Lewisburg, Tennessee, and gave his heart to the Lord, and became a pillar of the community there, really. I think he's passed now, and he finally wound up and bought the radio station. But he was a great, great radio talent that I remember to this day. Others, how could I ever forget Al Rotella calling basketball? Those who don't remember Al, and that's a long time ago, he was a University of Tennessee lineman, a New Jersey Italian, and weighed probably close to 300 pounds. And so Al sitting kind of with his stomach between his knees up on the crow's nest calling basketball was something to behold. But he did very well at it, and as I say, he was a great guy. A personal memory that I'll forever take with me, when I was going into the Army, the Piedmont Hotel was still operating. It was not run over with guests, but the restaurant was still open and was operating. And Al arranged to take over the restaurant one night before I went in, and he fixed us an Italian spaghetti dinner for about 25 or 30 of people at the station and my friends as a going away party. I'll never forget that.
We're pleased to have Smith Ray, with us on the radio this afternoon, WLAF in La Follette, and some local memories sharing with us.
Another great person of that time, which is no secret to anyone who might be listening to this, was John Brown. John R.W. Brown, what a great character and a great basketball coach. But John and I, when I was in high school, of course, I was not that much of an athlete and certainly not a basketball player, so I did not really know Mr. Brown. Then I became acquainted with him after I went to the radio station and was calling the basketball games. And John and I used to play golf regularly at the country club. And I think one of the classic matches of the annual tournament at the country club, John and I wound up in the finals of the fourth flight. And because we played kind of a similar game, we were both kind of duffers, if you can imagine John Brown duffing at anything. And it became quite a match to watch because no other local players were in the final flights. They were all people that had come into the tournament, and so we were the only known characters in the finals of the tournament. So it wound up that before we finished, there were about 50 people following us around, and I'm sure there may have been a bet here or there. But I beat John one up, and bless his heart, the last time I saw John Brown was, probably 7, 8, maybe 9 years ago when I was in La Follette one day, and he was out in front of the Piedmont building, and I pulled over and stopped and introduced him to my wife. And the first thing he said was, "You remember when you beat me by one stroke in that golf tournament?" So it was a guy that never liked to lose. I mean, losing was not in his vocabulary. But so that's about that. That takes you through the days. I remember my dad was the general manager of the La Follette Electric Department, which you call the board now. But he had to strain some real budget items, but they got it done. And he was responsible for putting the lights in the, I guess do they call it Liberty Park now where we played football?
Yes.
Anyway,
yes.
That was a great, great thing. I think that must have been in probably 49, because I graduated in 50, and I remember playing a night game there. So I think those lights went in there about 48, 49.
Well, I'll share with you something that Hugh Garner told me a couple of years ago, Smitty. He said we played in that big hole down behind the high school, talking about where they played.
And no dressing room.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, just rudimentary, but not like you would have today. Yeah, you got dressed and walk down the hill.
And we're visiting with a WLAF alum, Smitty Ray, here on the old radio station. Smitty, a graduate of La Follette High School, 1950, the class, and then, of course, worked a couple of stints here at WLAF.
One interesting thing that has really nothing to do with the radio station, but is a memory that I have. Chan Caldwell was a medium good football player at the University of Tennessee. He was a particular personal pet of General Bob Nealon. Chan was the kind of guy that apparently, of course I didn't know this was just kind of the story. He was always kind of getting in trouble, and General Nealon would intercede and get him out of trouble with the administration. But at any rate, he got out of school, and he was hired to coach football at La Follette. And he was just the most magnificent, happy-go-lucky guy you ever saw. But anyway, the story is, our first practice, I guess this must have been my junior year, which would have been probably 48, he enlisted the help of a bunch of his buddies on the University of Tennessee football team. Among them was Jim Myers, who wound up as being the assistant head coach of the Dallas Cowboys, Bud Sherrod, who was a consensus All-American defensive end, and several others. And these guys were working out in shorts, and we were in pads, and they were putting us through our paces. It was absolutely the most miserable week I've ever spent in my life. And I mean, because they played football as a serious game, but they shaped that team up pretty good, I'll tell you that. And Jim Myers, by the way, married Jim Agee's sister, and they lived in Dallas for many years. He was, if you remember the old Dallas football games with Tom Landry on the sideline, there was a guy with a nose that had been broken about 9 or 10 times, his assistant head coach, and that was Jim Myers.
Would you share the way it was at the radio station when it was there in the Piedmont Hotel building? Was the announcing booth, the control room, was it right there at the window looking out onto the street?
Yeah, except you didn't face, you faced, actually the transmitter was inside. We only had one announcing room, and the little transmitter was inside there with you, and your back was to that window. But as I recall, we had a blind over it, and then there was one small studio. And then the little office, golly Moses, was less probably than 250 square feet, the linotype machine. And it's interesting that you should bring that up, because the programming, of course, has changed so drastically. In those days, it was all pretty formal block programming, like 15 minutes of this and 30 minutes of that, and radio was still attempting to somehow compete with television, which was ridiculous, of course. but the management of WATO in Oak Ridge were, a couple of them at least, were seasoned radio professionals from the north, and they hung to the old block programming format. We had a thesaurus library, it was called. These were old 33 and a third transcriptions that were like, I guess, 18, 24 inches across. We had 78 records. 45s were beginning to come in, and we had to queue all those up. Now it's all electronic, and I wouldn't know even what I was doing looking at it. So we had to operate the board, cue the records, and read the copy at the same time, which was about like rubbing your stomach and patting your head at the same time. But I cannot tell you what it did to radio in this country. There were two things that occurred to AM radio, in my opinion, that changed it forever. One was the Today Show. People do not really remember that the Today Show started on NBC radio. And it was characterized by an easygoing, informal, chatty type, non-announcer type approach to things, as opposed to the old deep-voiced Nebraska, no accented announcers. And that changed the entire thought process of how radio should be conducted, that it could be informal and friendly, and it didn't have to be so doggone strict and regimented. The second thing, of course, was Rush Limbaugh. He changed the world. In fact, he probably saved AM radio. So that's the only comments that I would make about the programming itself. Our programming at the time was mostly popular music, very little country music until Denny Walker was there, and he was, as I say, great country. We had a couple of local string bands that would come in. In fact, one guy, I've often wondered what happened to him, because he was the best banjo player I ever heard in my life. And what was his name? Well, it was on the tip of my tongue, and I can't remember it. But and then we had on Sunday morning the usual run of ministers who would come, and that was an interesting story. I had the job of opening up on Sunday morning, being the kid in the beginning days, and so if we had a church minister from a rural church who had 5:30 in the morning till 5:45, and he hadn't paid, then it was my job to collect before he could go on air. And so some of these fellows would bring along a couple of their members, and I would say, now, Brother John, here's my record here that you owe $9.50 from last week, and so today is $9.50, and so that'll be $19 before we can broadcast today. And all the time I'm doing this while a record is playing back in the studio, or back and I'm in the little studio there, and so he's looking around, and so the two or three guys that he brought with him would all reach in their pockets, and they'd raise the money, and I would give him a receipt, and he'd go on the air. But that was one of our first early business experiences.
Would the banjo player have been Larry McNeely?
No, it wasn't he. I'll remember it, but boy. And if I don't, I'll call you back and tell you. But golly, he was good. This guy was like a mountain. He weighed probably 240. He had hands like hams, but he could absolutely three-finger that banjo to death. I mean, it was absolutely something else.
Smitty, anything else that comes to mind about WLAF and your days growing up and going to school here in La Follette that you'd like to share with us?
Well, no, other than, as I say, it was a different time coming up. And if I could tell you one little brief story that'll more or less illustrate that. Nowadays, you wouldn't dare let your 10-year-old child go across town. It's just unheard of. But I have a dear friend who was in my class, Jane Gross, now Jane Gross Lee, and there was a family called Lincolnfeld, and Mr. Lincolnfeld was the section boss of some such of the railroad. And the house he was provided was at Dove. So Jane and his daughter became friends at school, and so Jane would go to see her up at Dove, and you'll never guess how she got there. She would walk. They lived up on Riggs Hill, up toward where the Troutman House was, and she would walk all the way down by the Piedmont Hotel and go up to the train station, and Mr. Lincolnfeld would have a freight train stop, and the engineer would come down and get her up in the cab with him and take her to Duff and put her off at Mr. Lincolnfeld's house. If anyone had done that today, you'd say that they were making it up. It could never happen. So that's different. There's one other thing I'd like to add. You guys now are doing such a tremendous job in news coverage. This was something that was unheard of when we signed on back in those days. We did very, very little local coverage other than something that would walk in the door, like there's going to be a bingo party at the First Baptist Church on Saturday night, but nothing like the school board is meeting, or there's a wreck here, or so-and-so arrested, and so forth. You do a tremendous job at it, and you have my compliments for that.
Well, Smitty, that's a high compliment coming from you, because we certainly look up to you and what you have done over the years at WLAF and what you mean to us now here at WLAF. We appreciate you taking time to share some thoughts with us, and this has been just a real fun, just been a real treat. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm glad to have spoken with you, and I've enjoyed it. I'm hoping to get up there if they have the reunion days this year, which it was postponed from last year, the every 5-year. Linda Agee and I have conspired. There are about 4 or 5 of us that can still walk, and the class of 1950 has never shown up in that thing. So we were thinking about maybe marching in the parade this year, and if they have it, and if we do, I'll try to give you a notice and come by and say hello.
Well, we'll certainly plan on that, Smitty. It's a pleasure. Smith Ray, known as Smitty, thank you for taking time with us today.
And I appreciate you, Jim. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
See you, Smitty. Thanks. That is Smitty Ray, whose voice was heard on the very first day WLAF came on the air, May 17th, 1953.